Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel, and I'm here because I don't know where else to turn. I'm still trying to process what happened, and maybe putting it into words will help me make sense of it all. What I experienced just a few nights ago feels like something out of a nightmare, yet here I am, wide awake and living through it. It all started on a Friday evening. I wanted to surprise my wife, Claire, with a romantic dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant. We used to go there often when we were dating, back when everything felt simple, easy, and full of love. Lately, though, things had been different. Claire had become distant. At first, I thought it was work stress or the usual ups and downs of marriage, but deep down, a small, nagging voice kept whispering that something was wrong. I texted her earlier that day to meet me there at 7 p.m. She responded quickly with, "Sure, see you there." Her words seemed fine, but they lacked any warmth. No smiley face, no exclamation mark, just plain, detached words. I brushed it off, convincing myself I was overthinking. When I arrived, the warm glow of the restaurant's lights felt oddly comforting. The familiar aroma of garlic and fresh basil brought back memories of happier times, celebrating anniversaries, toasting to promotions, and simply enjoying each other's company. I clung to those memories as I stepped inside, hopeful that tonight could rekindle some of that magic. The hostess greeted me with a polite smile. "Good evening. Table for two?" "I'm meeting my wife, Claire," I said, trying to hide my nervousness. Her smile faltered just slightly, but enough to notice. "Oh yes, right this way." As I followed her through the maze of tables, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She led me toward the back of the restaurant, where a small, cozy corner overlooked the street. That's when I saw them. Claire was sitting at a table, leaning forward with a smile I hadn't seen in months. But it wasn't me she was smiling at. Across from her sat a man I didn't recognize, his hand resting casually over hers. He was laughing, and she was laughing with him, her eyes sparkling in a way I thought had been lost to time. My heart sank, and for a moment, I felt frozen in place. The room around me seemed to blur as my focus locked on them. I couldn't hear the clinking of glasses or the quiet hum of conversations anymore, just the deafening sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The hostess must have noticed my hesitation because she stopped and turned back to me. "Is everything okay?" she asked quietly. I nodded stiffly, though my mind was screaming otherwise. "Yeah, just give me a second." She nodded and walked away, leaving me standing there. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, even though the scene in front of me spoke volumes. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe it was just a work colleague, a friend, or something completely harmless. But deep down, I knew better. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching as Claire laughed, leaned closer, and seemed completely lost in this man's presence. It was the way she used to look at me. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I could have turned around and walked away, but something in me wouldn't let that happen. I needed answers. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. So, I straightened my shoulders, took a deep breath, and walked up to the table. Neither of them noticed me at first. They were too absorbed in each other. But when I cleared my throat, Claire's head snapped up, and the color drained from her face. "Daniel," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The man quickly pulled his hand away from hers, his expression shifting from confident to uneasy in an instant. I stood there, trying to keep my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "I didn't mean to interrupt," I said calmly, though my heart felt like it was breaking into a million pieces. "But it looks like I've walked into something I wasn't supposed to see." And that was the moment everything changed. Claire's face was a mask of shock, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words to say. The man across from her avoided my gaze entirely, his confidence visibly crumbling as he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The silence between the three of us stretched on, each second feeling heavier than the last. "Daniel," she finally managed, her voice trembling, "this isn't what it looks like." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty clear. Why don't you go ahead and explain it to me?" I kept my tone even, but my hands were clenched at my sides. I could feel the heat rising to my face, my pulse racing as I fought to keep my composure. I wasn't going to cause a scene. Not here, not in front of strangers. But I needed answers. I needed her to say something that could make this make sense, even though I knew deep down there was no explanation that would undo what I was seeing. The man, whose name I still didn't know, finally spoke up. Look, I didn't know she was. He stopped himself abruptly, glancing at Claire as if he'd said too much already. You didn't know what? I asked, narrowing my eyes at him. That she was married? Or that I might show up and ruin your little dinner date? He shifted again, his discomfort almost palpable, and I could tell he wasn't used to being confronted like this. I should probably go, he muttered, starting to push his chair back. No, I said firmly, my voice cutting through the tension. You're staying right here. If you're comfortable enough to hold hands with my wife in public, then you can be comfortable enough to explain yourself. He froze, his eyes darting to Claire as if waiting for her to take charge of the situation. But she just sat there, staring down at the table, her hands trembling slightly. The sight of her like that, so small, so guilty, should have made me feel something other than anger. But it didn't. It just made me realize how far apart we drifted, how much of our marriage had turned into a lie. Daniel, please, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. Can we talk about this later? At home? Why? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. So you can come up with a better excuse? So you can spin this into something it's not? No, Claire. We're talking about it right here, right now. In fact, I turned toward the man, who was now sitting frozen in his chair. Why don't you introduce yourself? Since you seem to know my wife so well. His face turned bright red, and he looked like he wanted to disappear. I'm Greg, he said finally, avoiding my eyes. We work together. I laughed bitterly again. Of course. Work together? That's the best you've got? This doesn't look like a business meeting to me, Greg. Claire's head snapped up, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and desperation. Stop it, Daniel. Just stop. You're making a scene. A scene? I repeated, incredulous. You're worried about a scene? Claire, you're the one sitting here on what looks like a date with another man. Forgive me if I'm not handling this with perfect grace. People at nearby tables were starting to glance over, their curiosity piqued by the rising tension at our table. I hated being the center of attention, but I couldn't bring myself to care. This wasn't something I could bottle up or save for later. I needed to confront it now, no matter how messy it got. Greg finally stood, grabbing his jacket. I think it's best if I leave, he mumbled, clearly eager to escape. Claire, we can talk later. Talk later? Those words sent a fresh wave of rage through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. Letting my emotions control me wasn't going to help. Instead, I stepped aside, gesturing for him to go. By all means, Greg, don't let me keep you. But I'd think twice before talking later. My tone was cold, measured, the kind of voice I used in high-stakes business negotiations. It felt foreign even to me. He didn't say another word as he hurried past me, his head down, avoiding the stares of the other diners. And then it was just Claire and me, sitting in the thick, suffocating silence he left behind. I slid into the chair Greg had vacated, looking directly at Claire. So, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. I think now's a good time for you to tell me the truth. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might actually tell me everything. But then she shook her head, her lips pressing together in a thin line. Daniel, No, I interrupted, holding up a hand. Don't start with excuses. Just tell me. Who is he? Really? How long has this been going on? And why, Claire? Why? The tears spilled over then, and she buried her face in her hands. It's not what you think, she said, her voice muffled. It's not. Then tell me, I said, leaning forward, my voice soft but firm. Because right now, it looks exactly like what I think. She didn't answer, just shook her head again. And as I sat there, waiting for her to speak, I realized that the truth I was looking for wasn't going to come easily. If she wasn't ready to tell me, I'd have to find out myself. But one way or another, I was going to get to the bottom of this. That's when I made a decision. one that would change everything. Claire's silence hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating and unbearable. I sat across from her, my patience wearing thinner by the second. Every tick of the clock on the wall seemed to echo in my ears, amplifying the tension. I could feel the eyes of the other diners on us, the weight of their curiosity adding to the pressure of the moment. But none of that mattered now. This wasn't about them. It was about Claire, me, and the truth I so desperately needed. She finally looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen with tears. "Daniel," she began, her voice barely audible. "No," I interrupted sharply. "Don't even start unless you're ready to tell me everything. No half-truths, no excuses. Just the truth, Claire." Her lips trembled as she opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She stared at me, her expression a mix of guilt and anguish, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was calculating, deciding how much she could say without completely incriminating herself. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Even now, she wasn't willing to be honest. Even now, she was trying to protect herself. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms as I let out a bitter laugh. "You know what? Don't bother. If you're not ready to tell me the truth, I'll find it out myself. And trust me, Claire, I will." Her eyes widened in panic. "Daniel, please. Don't do anything rash." "Rash?" I repeated, shaking my head. "You're sitting here with another man, holding his hand, laughing with him like I don't even exist, and you're worried about me doing something rash? Unbelievable." She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. I was too angry, too hurt to soften the blow. The waiter approached our table then, his nervous smile doing little to mask his discomfort. "Is everything okay here? Can I get you anything?" "No, we're fine," Claire said quickly, her voice trembling. I held up a hand, stopping him from leaving. "Actually, could you bring me the check?" I said, forcing a polite smile. "Just for her table. I won't be staying." The waiter nodded, clearly relieved to have an excuse to walk away. As soon as he was gone, I turned back to Claire. "I'm done sitting here, waiting for you to come clean," I said, my voice firm. "If you won't tell me the truth, I'll find it on my own." She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she tried to take mine. "Daniel, please," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't leave like this. Let me explain." "Explain what?" I snapped, pulling my hand away. "You've had plenty of chances to explain, Claire, but instead, you've lied, avoided, and deflected. I'm done playing this game. You can explain when you're ready to tell the truth. Until then, don't bother." I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor as I pushed it back. Claire looked up at me, her face pale and stricken, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the way she'd looked at Greg, the way she'd smiled at him, and the guilt evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. As I walked out of the restaurant, the cool night air hit me like a slap in the face. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, taking deep breaths to calm the storm raging inside me. My mind was spinning with questions, doubts, and the sinking realization that the life I thought I knew might have been a lie. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. Alex. My best friend and the one person I knew I could trust. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Hey man, what's up?" "Alex," I said, my voice tight with emotion. "I need your help. Can we meet up?" He hesitated, clearly picking up on the urgency in my tone. "Of course. Are you okay? What's going on?" "I don't want to talk about it over the phone," I said. "Can you meet me at my place?" "Yeah, I'll be there in 20 minutes. "Thanks, man," I said before hanging up. As I drove home, my mind raced with possibilities. Who was Greg? How long had this been going on? And, most importantly, why? What had I done, or failed to do, that pushed Claire into another man's arms? By the time I pulled into my driveway, Alex was already there, leaning against his car with a concerned look on his face. "Daniel," he said as I stepped out of my car. "What happened?" I looked at him, the weight of the night pressing down on me. "You're not going to believe this," I said, my voice cracking. And as I led him into the house, I realized that this was only the beginning. The truth was out there, and I was going to find it, no matter what it took. Alex sat across from me in my living room, his brow furrowed with concern as I recounted everything that had happened. From the moment I walked into the restaurant to the sight of Claire holding Greg's hand, I spared no detail. The words spilled out of me like a flood, the emotions raw and unfiltered. When I finally finished, Alex leaned back on the couch, running a hand through his hair. "Man, that's rough," he said, shaking his head. "I don't even know what to say. Are you sure about what you saw?" "I'm sure," I said firmly. "You didn't see the way they were looking at each other. That wasn't a business dinner or a friendly meetup. It was something more, Alex." "I know it." He nodded slowly, still processing. "So, what's your plan? Are you going to confront her again?" I sighed, rubbing my temples as the weight of the situation settled on my shoulders. I already tried that, and she wouldn't give me a straight answer. She's hiding something, Alex. I can feel it. And if she won't tell me the truth, I'm going to have to find it myself. Alex leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Okay, let's think this through. You said this guy, Greg, works with her, right? Do you know anything else about him?" "No," I admitted, frustration creeping into my voice. "But I know where Claire works, and I know how to do some digging. I just need to figure out where to start." Alex hesitated, then gave me a cautious look. "I don't want to overstep here, but do you want me to help? I can look into this guy, see if there's anything shady about him. You don't have to do this alone." I looked at him, the offer hanging in the air between us. Part of me wanted to say no, to handle this on my own, but the truth was, I needed someone in my corner. Someone I could trust. "Yeah," I said finally. "I could use your help, but let's keep this between us, okay? I don't want anyone else knowing about this until I have all the facts." "Of course," Alex said without hesitation. "You've got my word." The relief I felt in that moment was almost overwhelming. For the first time that night, I didn't feel completely alone. We spent the next hour brainstorming, coming up with a plan to gather more information about Greg and his connection to Claire. Alex suggested starting with social media, so I pulled out my laptop and began searching. It didn't take long to find him. Greg Daniels, mid-30s, a senior account manager at the same marketing firm where Claire worked. His profile was public, and as I scrolled through his posts, a pattern started to emerge. Pictures of him at office events, smiling alongside his coworkers. Posts about late nights at the office and team-building retreats. And then there it was. A photo from a company holiday party just a few months ago. Claire was in the background, laughing with a group of people, but Greg was in the foreground, his arm draped casually over her shoulder. My stomach twisted as I stared at the screen. It wasn't definitive proof of anything, but it added fuel to the fire of my suspicions. "Looks like they've been close for a while," Alex said, peering over my shoulder. "You think this started at work?" "Probably," I muttered, my jaw tightening. It's the perfect cover. Late nights, business trips. She could have been seeing him this whole time, and I wouldn't have known. Alex placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me. "Hey, don't go down that rabbit hole just yet. We don't know the full story. Let's take this one step at a time." He was right, but it didn't make it any easier. The questions swirling in my mind were like a storm, each one more painful than the last. How long had this been going on? What did he have that I didn't? And, most importantly, why hadn't Claire been honest with me? "Do you have access to her phone?" Alex asked cautiously. I shook my head. "No. She's always been protective of it. She keeps it on her, even at home." "Then maybe start with her routine," he suggested. "Pay attention to her habits, her schedule. See if anything stands out. If she's hiding something, she'll slip up eventually." I nodded, already forming a plan in my mind. I would watch, listen, and wait. If Claire was hiding something, I was going to find it. As Alex stood to leave, he placed a hand on my shoulder again. "You're a good guy, Daniel. You don't deserve this. Whatever happens, just remember that." I managed a weak smile. "Thanks, Alex. I appreciate it." After he left, I sat alone in the quiet of my living room, staring at the photo of Greg and Claire on my laptop screen. The night's events played over and over in my mind, each memory sharper than the last. I didn't know where this path would lead, But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let this go unanswered. The truth was out there, and I was going to find it, no matter how much it hurt. The next morning, I woke up early, the events of the previous night still fresh in my mind. Claire was already up, moving around the kitchen. I could hear the faint clinking of dishes and the low hum of the coffee machine. It was a picture of normalcy, but I knew better. The tension between us was like an invisible wall, and I wasn't sure how long I could stand pretending everything was fine. I walked into the kitchen, trying to act as casual as possible. "Morning," I said, grabbing a mug from the cabinet. Claire glanced at me, her expression guarded. "Morning. Coffee's fresh." "Thanks," I replied, pouring myself a cup. The awkward silence that followed was almost unbearable. Usually, we'd chat about our plans for the day or share a joke. But now, it felt like we were two strangers sharing the same space. I decided to test the waters. "You seemed upset last night," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Anything you want to talk about?" Her hand froze mid-reach for the toast she'd just made. She recovered quickly, but I didn't miss the flicker of unease that crossed her face. "I wasn't upset," she said, forcing a smile. "Just tired. It was a long day." "Right?" I said, pretending to buy it. "Work must be keeping you busy." She nodded, not meeting my eyes. "Yeah, it's been hectic lately. Lots of deadlines." I sipped my coffee, watching her carefully. "And Greg? Is he keeping up with the pace?" Her head snapped up, her eyes widening for just a moment before she caught herself. "Greg?" she repeated, her voice slightly higher than usual. "Why are you asking about him?" I shrugged, playing it off. "Just curious. You mentioned him a few times before. Figured he must be part of all those late nights at the office." Her grip on the edge of the counter tightened ever so slightly, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. "He's just a co-worker," she said quickly. "Nothing more." I didn't respond immediately, letting the silence hang between us. "Okay," I said finally, my voice calm. "I was just curious." She relaxed slightly, but the tension in her shoulders didn't completely fade. I knew I couldn't push too hard or too fast. If she felt cornered, she'd shut down completely, and I couldn't risk that. Not yet. The rest of the morning passed in strained politeness. Claire left for work earlier than usual, saying she had a meeting, and I was left alone in the house, my mind racing with questions. I decided it was time to follow Alex's advice and start paying closer attention to her routine. I'd been so caught up in my own life that I hadn't noticed the cracks forming in ours. Now, I was determined to notice everything. The first step was checking our phone records. I logged into our shared mobile account, scrolling through the call logs and texts. At first, everything seemed normal. Calls to her mom, texts from friends. But then I noticed a recurring number that didn't belong to anyone I recognized. The number appeared frequently, often during her late nights at work. My stomach churned as I stared at it, a sick feeling settling in the pit of my stomach. I knew it was Greg's number before I even confirmed it with a quick search. I leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding. This was more than just a hunch now. There was something going on, and I wasn't going to let it slide. The next step was to follow her. I hated the idea of spying on my own wife, but what choice did I have? She wasn't telling me the truth, and I needed answers. That evening, when she said she had to stay late at the office, I decided to test her story. I waited until she left, then grabbed my keys and followed her car at a safe distance. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, a mix of dread and determination coursing through me. She drove to the office, just as she said she would. For a moment, I felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe she really was working late. But as I parked a few spaces away and watched, that hope was crushed. Not 10 minutes later, Greg's car pulled into the lot. He got out, glancing around before heading into the building. I stayed in my car, my heart pounding as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe they really were working on something together. But then why had she been so defensive about him earlier? I waited, watching the lights in the office windows. Time dragged on, each passing minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, after almost 2 hours, the two of them emerged. They were laughing, their body language relaxed and familiar in a way that sent a jolt of pain through me. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. I couldn't confront them now, not without more evidence. But I knew one thing for sure, this wasn't over. As I drove home that night, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, betrayal, sadness, they all fought for dominance. But above it all was a single, burning thought. I would find the truth, no matter how much it hurt. And when I did, Claire would have no choice but to face it. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image of Claire and Greg laughing together in the parking lot. It played in my mind like a broken record, each loop tightening the knot in my stomach. I knew I was on the edge of a revelation, but I needed something concrete. A confrontation without evidence would only lead to more denial, and I couldn't handle that. Not again. I decided to dig deeper into Greg. His social media had been helpful, but it wasn't enough. I needed something more personal, more revealing. I started by looking up his name on public records. It was tedious work, but after a few hours, I found something interesting, a rental property listed under his name. Curiosity got the better of me, and I drove by the address that afternoon. It was a small, modest house on the outskirts of town, nothing remarkable. But as I parked a few houses down and waited, I saw something that made my heart drop. Claire's car pulled into the driveway. I watched in stunned silence as she stepped out, glancing around nervously before walking up to the door. She knocked twice, and Greg appeared almost immediately, ushering her inside. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. This was it, the proof I needed. But instead of relief, I felt a wave of nausea. Seeing her go into that house, seeing her choose him, it broke something in me. I stayed for nearly an hour, watching the house like it might somehow give me the answers I needed. When she finally came out, she looked different. Lighter, somehow, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It was a stark contrast to the heaviness that had settled on mine. As I followed her car home, my mind raced. What was I supposed to do now? How could I confront her without completely unraveling our lives? By the time I walked through the front door, Claire was already in the kitchen, making dinner like everything was normal. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Hey," she said, her voice light. "How was your day?" I stared at her, searching her face for any trace of guilt, but she was as composed as ever. "Fine," I said finally, forcing the word out. "Yours?" "Busy," she replied, turning back to the stove. "But good." Her casual demeanor was like a slap in the face. She'd spent the afternoon with another man, and now she was standing here, acting like nothing had happened. It was infuriating. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I held back. Not yet. Not until I had everything. That night, as Claire slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, wide awake. I was one step closer to the truth, but I knew the hardest part was yet to come. The confrontation. The fallout. I wasn't ready for it, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. The lies had gone on long enough. It was time to bring them into the light. The next morning, I woke up with a clear purpose. The weight of the past few days had settled heavily on me, but I couldn't let it hold me back any longer. It was time to confront Claire, no matter how much it hurt. I wasn't sure how she'd react or what excuse she'd try to use, but I knew I couldn't live like this anymore, questioning, doubting, and pretending everything was fine. Claire was already at the table when I walked into the kitchen. She was sipping her coffee, scrolling through her phone like nothing had changed. The sight of her acting so normal made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to sit down across from her. "Claire," I began, my voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." She looked up, her expression wary. "About what?" "You know what," I said, locking eyes with her. "I know about Greg. I know you've been spending time with him outside of work, and I know you haven't been honest with me." Her face went pale, and for a moment, she looked genuinely panicked. But then she straightened her posture, her eyes narrowing defensively. "Daniel, I don't know what you think you know, but you're wrong. Greg and I are just co-workers. That's it." I shook my head, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "Don't lie to me, Claire. I've seen the way you act around him. I saw you at his house yesterday. You can't explain that away." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, and for a brief moment, I thought she might finally admit the truth. But instead, she shook her head, her voice trembling with indignation. You followed me? That's insane, Daniel. Do you even hear yourself right now? I hear myself just fine, I said, keeping my tone steady. And you're not going to turn this around on me. You've been lying to me, Claire. I've given you every chance to come clean, and you've done nothing but deny it. So, I'll ask you one more time. What's going on between you and Greg? Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, her hands trembling as she placed her coffee cup down. It's not what you think, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Then tell me, I pressed. Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what I think. She took a deep breath, wiping at her eyes as she avoided my gaze. Greg and we've been talking. That's all. He's been helping me with some things I've been struggling with. At work. That's why I went to his house yesterday. We needed to discuss something privately. I stared at her, my disbelief evident. And you couldn't discuss it at the office? Or at home? You expect me to believe that? It's the truth, she said, her voice cracking. I know it looks bad, but I swear, Daniel, nothing's happened between us. He's just a friend. A friend, I repeated, my tone dripping with sarcasm. Right. Because friends hold hands at dinner and look at each other like they're the only two people in the world. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. You were there? Yeah, I was there, I said bitterly. I saw everything, Claire. And I'm done pretending that this is okay. The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging heavily between us. Claire's tears flowed freely now, her defenses crumbling as she buried her face in her hands. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice muffled. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Didn't mean for what to happen? I demanded, leaning forward. For me to find out? For you to get caught? Or for you to throw away everything we've built together? She shook her head, her sobs growing louder. I don't know, she cried. I don't know what I was thinking. I felt so lost, Daniel. I felt like we were drifting apart, and Greg, he made me feel seen again. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to be angry, to lash out, but all I felt was an overwhelming sense of sadness. This wasn't just about Greg, it was about us. About everything we'd ignored, buried, or left unsaid. Why didn't you come to me? I asked, my voice breaking. Why didn't you tell me how you were feeling? I tried, she said through her tears. But you were always so busy, so distracted. I didn't want to add to your stress. I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair as I tried to process everything. Her words stung, but they also forced me to confront a harsh truth. I hadn't been the best husband. I'd let work take precedence, let our relationship become an afterthought. But that didn't excuse what she'd done. I need time, I said finally, standing up. I need to think about everything you've told me and figure out where we go from here. Claire nodded, her tears still streaming down her face. I understand, she whispered. I walked out of the kitchen, my mind racing with questions I wasn't sure I'd ever find answers to. This wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for, but it was a start. And as I sat alone in my office, staring out the window, I realized that this was far from over. The truth might have started to come out, but the wounds it left behind would take much longer to heal. The days following that conversation with Claire were some of the hardest I've ever faced. I spent a lot of time alone, thinking about everything. Our marriage, the choices we both made, and the future that now hung in the balance. It wasn't just about her betrayal. It was about how we had both let the foundation of our relationship crack over time. Claire gave me space, as I'd asked. She moved into the guest room and kept her distance, but I could see the weight of guilt and regret in her every move. For the first time in years, we were no longer pretending everything was fine. And that, strangely, felt like the first real step forward. One evening, about a week later, I found her sitting on the back porch, staring out at the sunset. I hesitated before joining her, but something in the quiet of that moment felt right. Hey, I said softly, taking a seat beside her. She glanced at me, her eyes still red from crying but softer than they'd been in days. Hey. We sat there for a while in silence, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Finally, I spoke. I've been doing a lot of thinking, I began, my voice steady. About us. About what went wrong. And I realized something. We both let this happen. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't interrupt. I let work consume me, I continued. I stopped making you a priority, and I ignored the signs that you were struggling. And you made a choice to find comfort somewhere else instead of coming to me. We both failed each other, Claire. She nodded, her voice trembling as she replied, You're right. I should have talked to you, Daniel. I should have told you how I was feeling instead of turning to Greg. It was wrong, and I hate myself for it. But I never wanted to lose you. Her honesty hit me hard. For the first time, it felt like we were truly laying everything out in the open. No more walls, no more pretenses. I don't want to lose you either, I admitted. But if we're going to make this work, things have to change. We both have to put in the effort, not just to fix what's broken, but to build something stronger than what we had before. Claire wiped at her tears, a small, hopeful smile forming on her lips. I'll do whatever it takes, she said. I want to fight for us, Daniel. I want to be the wife you deserve. And I want to be the husband you deserve, I replied. But we have to take it one step at a time. It's not going to be easy, Claire. Trust doesn't come back overnight. I know, she said, her voice steady. But I'm ready to do the work. I love you, Daniel, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was one I was willing to walk, as long as we were walking it together. Over the next few months, we started rebuilding our marriage piece by piece. We went to counseling, both individually and as a couple, to confront the issues we've been avoiding for years. We made time for each other, rediscovered the things that had brought us together in the first place, and learned how to communicate in ways we never had before. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, still scars that hadn't fully healed. But with every honest conversation, every small act of kindness, we took steps toward healing. One night, as we sat together on the couch, Claire reached for my hand. Thank you for giving us another chance, she said, her voice filled with emotion. I squeezed her hand gently, a smile tugging at my lips. Thank you for fighting for us, I replied. And in that moment, I realized that while the past had tested us, it didn't have to define us. We weren't the same people we were before, but maybe that was a good thing. We were stronger now. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we had a future worth fighting for.